Last week, I did an experiment with diastatic malt powder, or DMP, and that was the first time I had ever used it before. I put the experiment on YouTube, and I got some additional information from a number of the viewers, which I appreciate. And so I did some more research and did another experiment, and here's what I learned. So for starters, I didn't know that DMP comes in different powers or potencies. I don't know how you want to put it. There's different strengths of DMP. Let's say that. So there's a scale called the degree Lintner that measures how potent a malt powder is. I had no idea. I thought they're all the same. Last week in my experiment, I used 2% DMP because that's what Tony Geminani recommends for his recipes. What I didn't know is the stuff that I used was a lot more powerful than the stuff he uses. Here's what I found out. The stuff Tony uses from Central Mills is 20 degrees on the Lintner scale. And take a look at the ingredients. This DMP has 3 ingredients in this order: flour, sugar, malt. Malt is the last ingredient. So out of curiosity, I looked at some other brands. King Arthur, for example, has a much stronger malt powder, coming in at 160 degrees on the Lintner scale. But if you look at the ingredients, it has the same ingredients. It's still flour, sugar, malt, but there's more malt and sugar. Okay, so with Central Mills, Tony's stuff, the ingredients are flour, sugar, malt. With King Arthur, it's flour, malt, sugar. Okay. Now, the stuff I used was from the Scratch brand. I bought it on Amazon, and I couldn't find how powerful it was or what degree on the Lintner scale it was, but there's only one ingredient, that's malt. People online are saying it's probably around 200. People who know a lot more than this about this stuff than I do. Let's just assume it's at 200. Could even go higher. But when I use 2% by weight of 200 degree on the Lintner malt, that is a lot more malt than Tony was using at 2% by weight of 20 degree malt. So you can go online and there's formulas to convert this. Like if I really wanted to follow Tony's recipe to a T and use 2% of 20 degree malt, when I only have 200 degree malt, I could go and figure out the math and get it just right. But I don't think you have to. I'm going to tell you why in just a minute. I wanted to mention also that some of you pointed out that American flours already have malted barley mixed into the flour. And from what I can tell, they all do, or almost all of them do at least. Now, how much and what degree of malt powder they use? Tom Lehman said that they are using 0.25% weight of 20 degree malt. So very little of very weak malt is what they're putting in the flour right now. And again, if you really wanted to, if you had a recipe that called for X percentage of malt at X degrees, you could go in there and figure out exactly how much when you would compensate for the malt already in the flour. But again, I don't think it matters that much. I'm going to tell you why in a minute. So for this experiment, I made 3 dough balls, 3 pizzas, one of them using sugar with my regular stock recipe. My regular stock recipe is just an overnight cold ferment with sugar. And then the second one had 0.2% malt, which is what some of the guys online were saying they do with the very strong stuff, like the stuff I used. And then I made the third one with 0.8% malt. And the reason I did that was that's actually the recommended amount by the manufacturer of the stuff I got. They didn't use percentages, but they said use X many teaspoons for X many cups of flour. And I did the conversion in the math, and it equals out to 0.8%. So I wanted to see how the 3 were different and take a look at these 3. As you can tell, they all look very, very similar. They all felt the same. They all had the same crispiness. They all had the same strength. They all have about the same size air bubbles, same color. So what about the taste? They tasted very, very similar also. In fact, I couldn't tell the difference between the one with sugar and the one with 0.2%. And by the way, I think I mentioned it last week, but all that malted barley does to flour is accelerate the breaking down of starch into sugar. And so when you add sugar, you're getting a very similar effect because the sugar that you add or the sugar that breaks down using powder, malt powder, helps to feed the yeast in the fermentation process and creates, the flavor and the gases and stuff. So I couldn't tell the difference at all between sugar and 0.2%. If you watched my video last week, I did point out that there's a huge difference from using sugar and no sugar at all. The sugar really does give the crust a lot more flavor and more color. All I'm saying here is the sugar and 0.2% of malt powder were about the same. So the next one with 0.8% malt powder was a tiny bit more flavorful than the sugar. When I say tiny bit, if I had to put a number to it, I'd probably say like 3% better, 2 to 3% better. I was thinking if you gave me a blind taste test, I don't even know if I could tell a difference, but since I knew one was malted and one was with sugar, I could tell just a tiny difference. So last week, I said that using 2% of the super strong malted powder made the crust about 5 to 10% more flavorful. 0.8% makes it about 2 to 3% more flavorful. You can make up your own mind if you agree with that, or if it's even worth using malt at that point or sugar. Sugar is a lot easier to keep around the house. You don't have to refrigerate it. It doesn't go bad like malt powder does. Anyways, the reason I said a few minutes ago, I don't think it really matters if you get the recipe just perfect with a DMP, is this. When I use 0.8%, and I noticed this much difference, and I used 2%, and I noticed this much difference, you see what I'm saying? Like it's just not that powerful of stuff. If I used over twice as much DMP last week than this week, and the difference in taste was negligible. However, what if you added over twice as much salt, for example, to your recipe? You'd ruin it, right? You just can't do that. Salt is too powerful. It makes too much of a difference. DMP doesn't. Whatever amount I'm using here, I'm just seeing like tiny bit difference. So that's my takeaway is I'm not buying in that DMP is all that important over sugar. Only a tiny bit better in flavor, tiny bit more flavorful. And I'm certainly not buying into the fact that you have to get down and dirty with the conversion scales and formulas to figure out exactly how much malt to put into your recipe, whether you're making pizza or bagels or, Italian bread, French bread, because it just doesn't matter that much. I'm just going to, moving forward, I think I'm just going to add some to my dough because, it may make a difference. Maybe this was like an overnight recipe, right? Overnight cold ferment. Maybe it'd make a more of a difference if I add like a 3-night cold ferment. Maybe. You could spend forever, I think, doing many different experiments with this stuff. From what I'm seeing, though, it just doesn't affect the pizza dough all that much. So I think what I would tell people is if you've got your favorite pizza dough recipe and it's a 1-night ferment or a 3-night ferment or whatever, hey, just do a couple of experiments. It just depends on how powerful your DMP is, on the Lintner scale. But do a couple of experiments and taste the difference for yourself. It won't be that much different than if you just use sugar. That's my conclusion. I may or may not do one more experiment on this. I kind of want to see how it reacts with, Italian flour, 00 flour. I believe that they don't put malted barley into those European flours, but I got to look into it more. I think, if they do not, then it's going to make a bigger difference with, I don't know, we'll see. I may just move on. I think I get the point with DMP. The point is it makes a little difference, but not that much more than sugar. That's pretty much it. Let me know what you think in the comments. Thanks.